Then Ahriman imagined a device in his black heart. He took upon himself the form of a youth and craved that he might serve the king as cook. And Zohak, who knew him not, received him well and granted him his request, and the keys of the kitchen were given into him. Now men had been nourished with herbs, but Ahriman prepared flesh for Zohak. New dishes did he put before him, and the royal favor was accorded to his savory meats. And the flesh gave the king courage and strength like to that of a lion, and he commanded that his cook should be brought before him and ask a boon at his hands. And the cook said, "If the king takes pleasure in his servant, grant that he may kiss his shoulders." Now Zohak, who feared no evil, granted the request, and Ahriman kissed him on his shoulders. And when he had done so, the ground opened beneath his feet and covered the cook, so that all men present were amazed thereat. But from his kiss sprang hissing serpents, venomous and black, and the king was afraid, and desired that they should be cut off from the root. But as often as the snakes were cut down, did they grow again, and in vain the wise men and physicians cast about for a remedy. Then Ahriman came once again disguised as a learned man, and was led before Zohak, and he spake, saying, "This ill cannot be healed, neither can the serpents be uprooted. Prepare food for them, therefore, that they may be fed, and given unto them for nourishment the brains of men, for perchance this may destroy them." But in his secret heart Ahriman desired that the world might thus be made desolate, and daily were serpents fed, and the fear of the king was great in the land. The world withered in his thrall, the customs of the good men were forgotten, and the desires of the wicked were accomplished. This is from the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings, an epic poem by Ferdowsi, which I've been stumbling upon throughout my research into Persian food and Persian food culture. And this epic work is a cornerstone of Persian Iranian culture for at least the past 1,000 years. And we'll see more about it later on our episode. Hello! Welcome back to The Delicious Legacy. I'm your host, Thomas Dinas, and I'll take you to another archaeogastronomical adventure. Thanks for joining me again. It's been a while, and this episode took a few months to come about. I wanted to talk about Persian food and Persian food culture in general, and that proved to be a more tricky thing to define than I thought. I want to find recipes from the deep past, from ancient Persia, the time of the Achaemenide kings and the Persian Empire. But again, that was not really possible. There wasn't much information or written recipes left or survived to this day. And of course, we have all this long history, and I wanted to see what's happening throughout the millennia in Persia, and going through the Parthians and the Sassanids and the conquest of the Arabs, and later on with the Safavids. So it was a long period trying to cover a lot of things and trying to find how food changed, but also how it remained the same. Needless to say, we're going through a huge adventure. But before we go into this, I want to thank you. I want to thank all the listeners all these years for your support. It means a lot, and without you the podcast wouldn't be possible. So thanks for listening, and thanks for thanks for spreading the word. This podcast can only happen with your generous support, and I would love if you can tell your friends and family and spread the word around, and basically leave some reviews and some ratings in Apple Podcasts, which is very important for all podcasts, really, to grow and being seen by different people. So, yeah, if you can, go to Apple Podcasts. If you listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, go there, leave a rating and a review, and so on. You can also check the podcast on Spotify as well, where you can leave a rating as well, but also Pocket Casts, it's very important, and of course Acast as well. I would also like to ask you some important favor. I want you to go to the British Podcast Awards and cast your vote for the Delicious Legacy podcast as the Listener's Choice Award. So if you go to www.britishpodcastawards.com/voting. There you can submit the Delicious Legacy as the podcast of your choice for the awards. So please do that until the 29th of August. I will leave a link as well on the show notes. Now let's dive into Persia. Before we go and talk about the food of Persia and Iran, which is interchangeable terms, I want to give some general information about the country, because it's an absolutely massive country. It has nearly 90 million people today, and from the northwest borders with Azerbaijan, Armenia and Turkey to the southeast, all the way to the borders with Pakistan, you cover a huge distance of more than 2,500 kilometers. So still a massive country. And in the past, throughout periods of glory and expansion of the different Persian empires, it was incorporating places as Iraq, bits of Syria, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, bits of Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on. So it was even bigger. Azerbaijan as well, bits of Armenia. I'm talking about the modern states of the modern countries of these places. So throughout the centuries and the millennia, the broader Persian culture was covering a much bigger geographical spread. So that as well gave me more difficulties to find exactly what I needed to say about the Persian food. In past episodes, I've covered tentatively things about Persian food, because obviously I had an episode about Mesopotamian food history. We're talking about the deep past. So I was talking about Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian foods, and what was found in cuneiform tablets in what is today mainly modern day Iraq and Syria and bits of Iran. Of course, similar foods were consumed in ancient Persia in the time of the Achaemenid kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius the First and so on. We're talking about 500 BC, before our common era. So yeah, 2,500 years ago, in the ascendancy and the glory of Persian Empire. So yeah, there were similarities with the region then, and also on the episode about pistachio, I talked about pistachio being really cultivated and spread from the area of modern day Iran around the world. But when we're talking about Persian food and ingredients and dishes, what else is there? In general terms, there are also the quinces and oranges and saffron and spinach. There were all these different fruits and vegetables, muskmelons, watermelons, pomegranates, grapes, peaches, mulberries. All this, they've been cultivated and grown in Iran since antiquity. As such, Iran, which covers a vast geographical area and spreads beyond today's borders, Iran can be seen as the center of an interchange between the civilizations of Anatolia, Caucasia, the Near East, India, Central Asia, and so on. Many crops and fruits and vegetables were transplanted from one to another of these regions by the way of Iran. Plants brought from India or through India were acclimatized in Iran earlier than in lands of other Near and Middle Eastern civilizations. For example, we have sugarcane, which came from India, and even further in the past from Papua New Guinea, the aubergine or eggplant, as it's known in the New World, various citrusy fruits like lemon and bitter orange, and watermelon. And this is in antiquity. Later, we had also rice and tropical spices, which they were also used as medicine. Obviously, we have indications about saffron and rhubarb and spinach that they were first cultivated on the Iranian plateau and from there spread east and west. Additionally, onions and garlic and carrots and broad beans, chickpeas and linseed are known to have been used for food in Iran since the early ancient period. And all these fresh fruit and vegetables played an important role in Iranian people's diet, which was, of course, helped by the development and spread of elaborate irrigation techniques and the intensive plantation systems and delightful gardens and orchards from ancient times, which we will see very soon in our episode. Of course, very important for me and very interesting was to find out, since I'm covering such a huge timeline and space, it was very interesting for me to find out what has changed in the Iranian cuisine all these millennia and what stayed the same, and how food evolved basically through these thousands of years. In ancient and medieval Persia and Iranian ceremonies, festivals, celebrations, food played an important role, and it's intimately connected with these celebrations. We do find today as well how important food is in celebrations in today's Iran, like the winter festival, summer festival, spring, autumn, weddings, and so on. So there is a lot of things that we can explore in the next hour or so of the podcast. Important role in all this also played the Persian religion, which was called Zoroastrianism, and it's probably one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths. Although Persian Empire in the ancient world, we're talking about the time of Cyrus the Great in 600 BCE, it was a multi-faith empire with lots of religions and lots of polytheistic religions. Zoroastrianism was monotheistic, and it probably arose about 800 to 1,000 years earlier from Cyrus, so most likely between 1,500 to 1,200 BCE, and in an area what is now today southwestern Afghanistan. Again, Persian culture spreads a lot more than today's borders. And Zoroastrianism shaped this Persian empire, which was then, it was the largest empire the world has ever seen. Cyrus the Great was, by most accounts, a devout Zoroastrian. And there is this concept of the idea of a single God, as we said, of heaven, hell, this duality of good and evil, the day of judgment, which are things that may have passed through Babylonia and the Jewish population there, and they influenced the religion that we know today as Christianity, of course. Zoroastrianism was even more important in subsequent Persian dynasties, so the Parthian and the Sasanian empires, which were really big, as we will see in our food recipes and dishes in a bit. There is a Zoroastrian critique of eating cattle, so it's found in a cuneiform tablet. Basically, one of the gods says to the cattle, "Give yourselves to the material world so that people may eat you." And the cattle saw in their spiritual state the afflictions which would befall them from people at this time, and they complained to Osmad over the matter. Osmad made a treaty with the cattle before he created their body, saying, "Give yourselves, for if you commit a sin, it will not be reckoned to your account." The cattle said, "To whose account will be reckoned?" And he said, "One who eats your flesh and commits a sin by his hand. All the sin that the cattle has committed will be reckoned to his account." Persian, which comes from the word Pars, which means the people of the area of Iran that Cyrus the Great was, and they spread from there to conquer the Medes and the Elamites and the Babylonians and create the empire, were mostly initially nomads, nomadic people, And we know during his lifetime, Cyrus the Great conquered, and he went from a tribal leader and conquered Babylon, as we said, and Anatolia, and so on, and spread through very much throughout the Middle East and Asia. And there's a story about him being anointed as king and drinking mare's milk and eating pistachios as part of this ceremony. And we know mare's milk is like fermented mare's milk is drinking a lot in the nomadic people's cultures. And of course, pistachio are a very important crop, and they come from Iran. One of the first and most important things that when we talk about Persian food culture is that the word, the gardens basically, the beautiful, magnificent gardens and orchards with running waters and herbs and trees and all this notion of this beauty and this abundance in the desert. It was something that it was actively promoted and cultivated by the Persians, and from them spread and influenced the Arabs later on and spread all the way to Spain as well. Yeah, for example, we have the gardens of Babylon and all that kind of, all those kinds of miracles that the Greeks speak about. Even Herodotus tells us that the Persian kings liked gardening, and their gardens held every sort of plant and flower irrigated by running water, which was a precious commodity for the inhabitants of the Iranian plateau. One important feature was that the streams crossed at certain points to divide the gardens into 4 separate green spaces. Basically, these were called, these gardens, marked as walled enclosures called paradaida in Persian. And this is where our modern word paradise comes from. Simply, the Persian word paradise meant a walled enclosure, and probably derives from Avestan roots, so the word peri, around, and dis, shape. And the word paradise subsequently was used for the Garden of Eden, and then of the abode of God and the place where the virtues live after death. But that's a lot later, of course, in the Christian notion. The gardens and the concepts of gardens as a perfect place appears way back in Mesopotamian literature from the Epic of Gilgamesh, with one of the lines going, "With crystal branches in the golden sands, in this immortal garden stands a tree, with trunk of gold and beautiful to see." It was thought of as the garden of the gods and described as paradise. Earthly gardens were made as representations of paradise. Water symbolized life, and as it was believed to be the source of life. Irrigation canals made this cultivation possible, and parts of the Iranian plateau were under cultivation by 3000 BCE. So yeah, then this garden and gardening notion has long tradition in the Iranian history. Plants and trees symbolize deities. Ceramic representations of the world divided into 4 quarters with a pool of life at the center date from back then. Even an Akkadian king proclaimed himself king of the 4 quarters. The Chahar Ba, which is the 4-partitional garden, which comes from the word Chahar, 4, and Ba, garden. And this idea dates to at least 2000 BCE. But to be sure, it's not known when the first gardens were laid out on this pattern. What we know, what we have, the oldest Persian garden that there are records belongs to Cyrus the Great from around 546 BCE, so 6th century before our Common Era, in one of his capitals at Pasargadae in the province of Fars, which is the modern way of saying Pars, where Persia takes its name, just north of Shiraz. And we know these gardens had a geometrical plan and stone watercourses. Eating and other social activities would take place in the garden pavilions, where you could catch the breeze but be protected from the sun. Gardens contained fruit trees and flowers, including the lily and the rose, were very important for the Achaemenids. And when in 330 BC, Alexander the Great saw the tomb of Cyrus the Great, recorded that it stood in an irrigated grove of trees. So as we said, Chahar Ba describes the 4-square plan of a Persian paradise garden. And the oldest example of a rectangular canal pattern is at Pasargadae. The path shown crossing the canal is, however, conjectural, and the oldest of a square divided into quadrants was made some 1,000 years after. This model, this Chaharba model of landscape, was later exported, as we said, to the rest of the world, to such places as Agra in India and Andalusia in Spain. And as we said earlier, the Persians called these gardens, marked as a walled enclosure, a paradiда. So the Greeks borrowed the term and used it in the language as paradisos. By the time the Bible was translated into Greek, the term was already meant a heavenly place for those who responded to God's commands and instructions. Iran had made of these paradises, and the ancient Persians not only cherished them, but also used the concept as part of their ideological empire building as such. The Achaemenid Persians, in effect, meant to conquer the entire known world in the name of establishing a paradise on earth. When Cyrus the Younger showed his palace gardens at Sardis to a Greek in 407 BCE, he called it Paradisa and explained, "All these things, Lysander, I measured out and ordered myself. There are some of them that I even planted myself." Precise geometrical regularity was the outstanding characteristic of Persian gardens. It was combined with a mystical love of flowers, trees, and above all, water. Water was used in channels and trees were planted in rows. Earlier, Darius I, he built a ceremonial capital in Persepolis and an administrative capital at Susa. And the latter was a walled and moated city, a city in a garden and a garden city. As we said, Persians, due to their nomadic nature, they had many capitals around their empire. So Persepolis was one, Susa was another, Cyrus the Great made the Pasargadae, and so on. There were a few different ones. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our sources for Persian food are a bit scant. What's on archaeological records helps us, and sadly we have a lot of words by the Greeks, which can lead us to some historical bias as well. In a sense, we have the way of what the Greeks thought and how the Greeks thought about the Persians and Persian culture in general, and we see that through the food. So that leads to a little bit of a bias, to be honest. The riches and the luxury were astonishing compared to the simple living and resource-poor ancient Greeks. So what's happening is we see the Persians' lifestyle and their food perhaps making them corrupt and lazy in the eyes of the Greeks. And thus, that's why they won against the Persians. That's their excuse or their justification of their wins in the Persian wars. Of course, things are a lot more complicated and different than that. We know the Achaemenid kings had luxurious feasts, and we know that from elaborate sculptures. There was silver incense burners that were burning exotic aromatics from faraway lands to purify and cleanse the air, and the dining rooms of the king's entourage. Drinking bowls, rhytons, which are wine-pouring vessels, and wine amphorae made of silver were used in these parties, and used, of course, to drink ostentatiously, theatrically, and stylish. If you see these rhytons, these pouring vessels, they look like a horn in one side, with a carving of an animal from the other side. But they were not meant to be used as a cup to drink from there. You would pour your wine there from the opening of the end that looks like a horn, and at the other end, where there's a sculpture of an animal or some scene or another, there's a small opening, which the king himself would stop with his finger from pouring out, and then he would have on the other hand the drinking bowl, and then from a distance would let the opening, and then the wine would pour into his drinking bowl. So yeah, it was very theatrical and stylish. And yeah, if you think about modern Basque, how they pour the cider from very far away to the glass, something like that. For Persian eating habits, we have that some passages from Herodotus that gives us indication of how they ate, how their meal was constructed, and what were the differences between Persian and Greek customs. So Herodotus says, the day which the Persians are accustomed to celebrating most is a person's own birthday. On this day, they think it's normal to serve a more abundant meal than other days. On this day, the rich are served an ox, a horse, a camel, or an ass, which are roasted whole in the ovens, while the poor are served lesser kinds of livestock. They eat fewer courses, but more desserts that are not all served all together. This is why the Persians say that the Greeks eat meals only to stave off hunger, because after the meal they do not have any substantial dessert, and if it were given to the Greeks, they would never stop eating. The contrast between those two practices is seen now from the Persian perspective. The comparison rests essentially on the difference in size between portions and desserts. The Persians eat fewer portions but more desserts, while the Greeks hardly eat desserts but more portions. It seems like the implicit idea that leads the Persians to judge the diet to be superior of the Greeks is the notion of pleasure. The Persians are what we would call today foodies, right? Gourmands, who appreciate desserts. The Greeks, on the other hand, according to them, are content with a diet that staves off the hunger. In Xenophon's book, The Education of Cyrus, he describes the diet of the Persians. In former times, it was their custom to eat only a single meal, so that they might devote the day to activity and exercise. Of course, nowadays the single meal still prevails, but they begin to eat at the hour when those who have lunch earliest begin their meal, and they spend their time eating and drinking until the hour when those who go to bed latest have dinner. Thus, this text informs us of another practice of the Persians, that they take a single meal. So in Cyrus' time, the single evening meal meant that it was not lost to eating, and that the whole day was dedicated to active life and exercise before eating. However, this practice changed into decadence of the Persian customs at the time of Xenophon, and that's what he wishes to show us, that the Persians are decadent and hence easily defeated. The Persian state at the time provided their workers and employees meals as partial payment of salaries, and they distributed food as well. Dining events at the Persian capitals were large. Ctesias, which is another Greek author who wrote about Persia, states that 15,000 men dined 3 times daily at the court of the Achaemenide emperor. Heraclides of Cumae writes that the king's dinner may sound imposing, but if examined closely, the dinners turn out to be economically organized events and not wasteful. And Xenophon again writes, for just as all other arts are developed to superior excellence in large cities, in that the same way the food at the king's palace is also elaborately prepared with superior excellence. All those who attend upon the Persian kings when they dine first bathe themselves and then serve in white clothes and spend nearly half the day on preparations for the dinner. A piece of bread was held in the left hand, the piece of food was cut with a knife and then placed on the piece of bread, and then a combination was placed in the mouth. As we said, the ancient Persians were big in their desserts, and that was transmitted throughout the centuries. We will see later that the Sassanids and subsequent Arab Persia was full of desserts and big on desserts. A Macedonian writer on the 2nd century lists ingredients on the king's dinner as sweet grape jelly, candied turnips and radishes prepared with salt, candied capers with salt, delicious stuffings, Ethiopian cumin and Median saffron, and so on. There are references in dates, pomegranates, figs, apples, raisins and almonds, quince and pears, and all these fruits and nuts were classic ingredients in the Persian cuisine, and they are still today. One important ingredient from ancient Mesopotamia, Persia, throughout the history up to today is the sheep tail fat. It's been used a lot in cooking as an important cooking fat. So So fat-tailed sheep are prevalent in Iran today, and they have a long history. They have a distinctive large tail in which the fat is stored. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Iran in 13th century, wrote, "Then there are sheep here as big as asses," meaning donkeys, "and their tails are so large and fat that the one tail shall weigh around 30 pounds. They are fine, fat beasts and afford capital mutton." This fat, which is used as cooking, when being melted, has an unpleasant smell. But once melted, it gives a pleasing fragrance and delicate flavor to many Persian dishes, especially rice. The duality of good and bad in Zoroastrianism, and that duality that penetrates Iranian life generally, from pastoral versus an agricultural civilization, vegetarianism versus meat eating, it can be seen in writings as well. There is a poem from early 2nd century BCE written in the Parthian language by an anonymous poet who sets up a verbal dialogue between a palm tree and a goat. So the tree lists for the goat all the benefits it provides. A palm tree in the land of Assyria. Its trunk is dry, its top is moist, its leaves resemble canes, its fruits resemble grapes, and it bears sweet fruits for a people. In summer, I am a shade over the heads of rulers. I'm vinegar for farmers, honey for noblemen. I am a nest for little birds and shade for travelers, who eat fruit from me until they become full. The goat challenges and ridicules it and lists its own benefits. They make my skin into water bags. In the plain and the desert, on a hot day and at noon, cold water is from me. They make tablecloths for me on which they arrange meals. The opulent, great feast they adorn with my meat. Bread and roasted flour and cheese and all the pastries. They make trimmings for me for beer, kumis, and wine. I am milk and cheese. They dry my yogurt for palaces. Harp and lyre and lute and kither. Every instrument they play on me. Since the beginning, that is primeval creation, I go pasturing on the mountains, the sweet-smelling mountains. I eat fresh grass and drink cool water from springs. And in the end, the poet proclaims the goat as the winner. As we've seen from Herodotus, and we know from the past as long as perhaps 5000 BC, the inhabitants of Iran were wine drinkers. Herodotus, for example, tells us about Persians' love of wine, and Persian poets then and later confirmed it in their verses. So we have a verse from Hafez, for example, where he writes, "With wine beside a gentle flowing brook, this is best. Withdrawn from sorrow in some quiet nook, this is best. Our life is like a flower that blooms for 10 short days. Bright laughing lips, a friendly fresh-faced look, this is best." And then there's another one. "When those who know what's what get together to dine, we want 3 things no more, kebabs and music and wine. But snacks or books of poems or backgammon, these we decline. Backgammon strictly for hovels, books in schoolrooms are fine, and snacks belong in bazaars. No, we find we confine our requirements to 3, kebabs and music and wine." As we've seen, the Persians had the concept and the tradition of serving wine accompanied by a sweet course after the main meal, and that easily 2,500 years old, right, in the ancient Persian courts. They probably believed also that finishing a meal with sweets helped the digestion. We've seen what Herodotus said about finishing the courses, the meals. Professor and linguist Daniel Zurawski says that it was the Persians whose love of desserts was the impetus that eventually changed these simple wafers and nuts into our modern desserts. So after the main meal, ancient Iranians would clear away the sofre, which is the cloth or the setting, and prepare a new setting, usually outside in the garden, where they would serve wine together with many light sweets and small dishes, such as fresh or candied dried fruits, nuts, and dragees, which is nuts coated in sugar. A particular favorite of the 6th century Persian king Khosrow, who considered it the best dessert and liked to serve it in Nowruz, the Persian New Year, was losinage, which was made of almonds ground together with sugar and rose water in a delicate pastry. And this may also have been the origin of macaroon, which continued to be flavored with rose water and musk in Europe until the 17th century. And the original Persian baklava would not have been too different from the baklava we see today. Okay, and somewhere here, we are finishing part 1 of our exploration into ancient Persia and her culinary treasures. In part 2, we will travel a little bit forward in time, in the Sassanid era, and later on after the Arab conquest. And this is going to be released next week. If you want the whole episode now and ad-free, you can join my Patreon subscription, where you get all the episodes early and ad-free. But if you can wait 1 week, I'll be back with more archaeogastronomical adventures. Looking forward to seeing you there. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast.